Welcome to BayWa RE Solar Tech Talk, your go-to resource on solar and storage solutions for both residential and commercial installations. With this podcast, solar and storage distributor of industry-leading brands, BayWa RE, is pleased to bring you some of the best and brightest experts to share their knowledge about different topics in the industry. Each episode is designed to provide you with valuable insights into the latest industry trends, enabling you to serve your customers better and contribute to the growth of the solar energy in your community. If you're a regular listener, you're already familiar with the diverse perspectives brought to you by the experts from BayWa RE Solar Distribution. My name is Daniela Schwartzman, Marketing Relationship Manager at BayWa RE, and I am thrilled to guide you through this exciting podcast about one of the hottest topics in the industry, domestic content. It is my pleasure to introduce you now our fantastic experts from some of the most respected manufacturers in the industry. First is Corey Geiger, Chief Operating Officer of Enstall US. Corey, would you mind sharing a little bit with our audience who you are and what Enstall does?
Thanks, Daniela. I really appreciate that. We're really happy to be on this webinar today, and thank you for your time. Thank you for the invitation. As you said, I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Enstall. Enstall is the parent company for three brands that I think many of our listeners will know: EcoFasten Solar, Iron Ridge, and PanelClaw. EcoFasten and Iron Ridge are predominantly residential mounting system solution providers, and PanelClaw is a commercial and industrial solar mounting solutions company, primarily focused on the C&I space. I've been in the solar business for 13 years now, and have seen a lot of changes in the tariff environment, the industrial policy environment, and I look forward to having this conversation with you today about domestic content.
Fantastic. Thank you. We're so thrilled to have you. Our next expert is Eric Bergman, Sales Director C&I at Enphase. Eric, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself and about Enphase?
Certainly, yeah. First and foremost, thanks for the opportunity to join the podcast today. Agree, a very hot topic in the industry, so excited to dig into it. My name is Eric Bergman. I'm the C&I Sales Director here at Enphase Energy. A little background about me is I've been in the renewable space for my entire professional career. Been in solar for about the past 13. Worked for a lot of asset management and monitoring providers before working for inverter OEMs. And I've been here at Enphase for a little bit over a year and a half, really helping them launch their first dedicated commercial solution offering and building out our commercial services team here at Enphase as we expand our capabilities into that growing and interesting market sector, in addition to, of course, our core of residential. For those that aren't familiar, Enphase is really a leading energy technology company, and we've really built our business around the microinverter architecture. We were founded in 2006, and we're headquartered in Fremont, California. Have about 2,500 employees globally as of kind of the middle of this year. And Enphase has shipped approximately 75 plus million microinverters and about 1.5 gigawatts of energy storage systems. We also have a host of service offerings as well as software, EV charging, really positioned for the residential and commercial and DG market sector.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here. Last but not least, we have David Dunlap, our very own VP of Product Strategy at BayWa. David, what should the audience know about you and about BayWa?
Thanks, Daniela. And I too am very excited about this conversation and to be surrounded by such talent and strong industry advocates. I've been with BayWa for coming up on 9 years now. I love being in the solar distribution space, getting to work with the best of the best and the brightest in the U.S. solar market. And it's my pleasure to be able to participate in these kinds of thought leadership program conversations and kind of help all of the industry perform to the best of their abilities and grow the adoption of renewables. That's been my mission for since I joined solar, but also for the 2 decades prior to that when I was in construction management. I did my first solar design classes back in 03, 04, something like that at SEI in Carbondale, and have been a strong advocate for renewables in the building space ever since. So my pleasure.
That's a little bit of wonderful. I'm super, super excited. As you can see, dear audience, we have a fantastic expert panel. Let's dig right in. David, do you mind kicking us off with some general context and definition, what we're talking about?
Absolutely. So we're here today to talk about, as you said in the intro there, Daniela, the hot topic of domestic content. So I think the place we need to start, just to kind of make sure that everybody listening is on the same page. What is domestic content? Why do we care? Why are we talking about it? What's going on? What is it? What isn't it? Corey, can you kick us off? Give us a little bit of the sort of high level policy. Where did this come from? Why is it now? How did we get here? What's the context?
The context around domestic content really arises from a move in recent years by both the Trump administration and the Biden administration to try and revitalize manufacturing in the United States. The IRA is intended to be a stroke of American industrial policy to try and therefore increase the number of jobs in the United States that are tied to domestic manufacturing. And the domestic content bonus credit was specifically crafted to encourage manufacturers or sellers of equipment for solar PV and other renewable technologies to bring that manufacturing from offshore locations back to the United States.
That's great. So you mentioned it was sort of driven by that manufacturing perspective and the commercial and industrial. Is that in fact the limit of this? Are we really talking about this as a commercial offering?
When we say commercial offering, and you think about the specific in the IRA that tries to incentivize the repatriation of manufacturing, the domestic content bonus adder, which comes on top of the base credit on the ITC of 30% for solar installations, and on top of there are certain advantages as well for larger systems for bringing domestic content back to the supply of solar projects. It really is there to incentivize a broad spectrum of renewable project deployments. So whether we're talking about large stuff at the utility scale or we're talking about things all the way down to the residential scale, it really is a broad brush approach to bring as much of the manufacturing of the equipment stack that goes into renewable projects, and specifically solar as well, to the United States. So you're seeing, as a result, a lot of commitments being made, either ground being broken, or production actually starting to happen, or even some additional commitments by some other folks to actually bring large-scale manufacturing back. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it does bring a lot of module production back. There's a real drive to try and make sure that the cell capacity located in the United States can support everything from utility scale all the way down to residential as much as possible. And then that extends over to power conversion, so inverters of any scale, and of course racking as well, whether we're talking about utility scale or all the way down to the racking that the brands that Enstall offers from Panel Claw and C&I, and from EcoFasten and Ironbridge, who are primarily in residential. We are also incentivized to bring as much of our manufacturing back to the U.S. as we can.
That's awesome. And Eric, I assume Enphase, similar kind of a story, right? There's the commercial and the manufacturing, but it really directly benefits both parts of the DG space. Would you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. So, from a residential perspective, the folks that are really able to capture a lot of the benefit associated with the domestic content bonus credit are a lot of our TPO partners and lease partners. So it is a common point of confusion, and I think maybe something that we should clear up maybe at the front end right now, where this domestic content bonus credit is really designed to be taken advantage of by commercial entities. And that's really the key word within the tax code, commercial entities. So we have a lot of homeowners that do a lot of research, and it's great that they're doing that. And they see, for instance, the domestic content bonus credit. If you are a homeowner and you're buying your system in cash, for instance, you are not a commercial entity as a homeowner. So that is something that I think we're trying to teach our partners. We're trying to teach the homeowners that we interact with, that domestic content bonus credit cannot really be captured as a homeowner, but can be captured if you're working with a lease, a loan, a TPO entity, which is a commercial entity. On the commercial side, it's kind of fair game across the board, because we have installers that are going into these commercial markets. They are installing commercial systems on small and medium commercial sized businesses, everything from the small mom and pop coffee shop up to the logistics facility at megawatt scale. And because that is a commercial entity purchasing that system, they're able to capture the domestic content bonus credit.
So just to say it one more time, maybe a little differently, and jump ball for either of you or both that want to jump in. We're talking about a credit, but it is specifically a tax credit, and where the ITC, a lot of consumers and probably even installers are used to thinking about that ITC credit being available for any tax filer. The point that you guys are making, and I've tried to make as often as I can, but I want to just make sure our listeners are clear. The tax liable party, which is the commercial business entity that owns the assets here, is the one that's going to benefit from this adder.
Precisely. And it is the commercial business entity, or really the end user, that should be thinking about some of the associated paperwork, filing, working with your commercial tax and legal representatives that support your business to really work through this entire process. So another point of confusion, it's not the installer that is filing this tax credit. It is the mom and pop coffee shop that's filing the tax credit. It's the large logistics facility that is filing the tax credit, not the installer or developer.
And so presumably it's on them to ensure compliance, but it seems like these folks also kind of don't know what those rules are. So obviously we're all here to try and help dispel that and to guide, but is there some sort of a disclaimer we need to make as manufacturers and distributors, and as well for the installers to be clear on about where this tax liability lies and how we navigate that jointly for everyone's benefit?
It is really important, and Eric's done a really good job of sort of encapsulating who's really eligible. It's a commercial entity, and it means that for equipment suppliers like ourselves, we are working very closely with the commercial entities that end up owning these systems, whether those systems be are systems that are on residential rooftops that are financed through a power purchase agreement or even a lease. It's the holder of that power purchase agreement, the owner of the system, who is either leasing it to the homeowner or providing that power at a price to the homeowner, that is really taking this risk. And they are quite sensitive to the fact that they want to be able to rely on being able to factor the domestic content bonus credit into the financial picture that they build when they're setting up their pricing for their leases or for their PPAs. And as a result, they want to make sure that they're working with suppliers who are providing them with a higher degree of certainty that when the IRS comes knocking later to check their homework, that they've really got product that was actually manufactured in the United States working on those projects.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's interesting where from an Enphase perspective, as we talk to installers and really the market in general, this is a new concept for a lot of installers. And I think it is an interesting inflection point for the partners that we work with, where, yes, it is a new concept. Yes, it involves taxes and IRS and the word audit, which can scare some people. But for the installers and the partners that understand the core concept of the opportunity that is associated with this domestic content bonus credit, it is creating a differentiating factor in their business proposition and their project delivery and the associated cost of that project delivery that really separates them from their competition. So while we are saying some scary stuff like tax and risk and liability, high level, I think the concept can be understood by both the installer, and then we teach the installer to help the customer get comfortable with that. And when all of these parties really understand it and follow the process, it does provide a very interesting differentiating factor for our installers. And that's really why we're here today, to educate installers so they can better educate their customers.
I would agree with that, Eric. I think it actually is creating an opportunity for installers who choose to really educate themselves on the potential opportunity that third-party financing might bring them in the near term. It actually creates some innovation in the third-party financing space, both in terms of the price that gets passed down to the customer, but also the payment arrangements that might be available to the installers themselves, that certain third-party financing firms might be offering to try and differentiate themselves in the market. So an informed installer is one that empowers themselves to really shop around a little bit and be able to bring potentially a differentiated value proposition to their customers when they're going to sell to the market.
I don't want to lose this train, but so I kind of want to put a pin on this differentiation and come back to it. But I want to take a slight detour to the side here to clarify one thing, which is we're talking about tax and audit and the IRS. Corey, are these rules all finalized yet? And do we know what the process looks like for a tax filer? My understanding is that there's a pre-approval application for funds for compliant projects that has to be done first, and then an approval after the project is completed, in order to, like, that's your whole evidence that you're submitting with your tax filing. But I also know, like, Treasury hasn't quite finished all of this. So can you help clarify for us, like, how far ahead of the curve are we on all this as an industry?
I'm sorry, this is going to sound a little cynical, but I'm going to use two hackneyed expressions. One is that this is a moving target, and the other one is that it's kind of clear as mud right now.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is the IRA was originally passed in August of 2022, but as with many pieces of legislation, actually putting it into practice required some additional development by the executive branch of rules and standards to make sure that the law would be properly implemented. And we've seen a lot of that with regard to the various bonus credits that are connected to the ITC in particular, and domestic content even more than most. In the case of domestic content, the evolution has gone from a position where in May of 2023, we had some guidance come out from the Department of Treasury that basically required a process similar to what you were just explaining, David, where manufacturers had to disclose their manufacturing costs on a per project basis, make sure that the eventual owner of that project was clear about those and could then provide a level of certification at the time that they were actually putting the project into service and taking their tax credit, that they could actually attest in a fiduciary manner, a legally binding manner, that they had achieved the requirements of making sure that a minimum percentage of the equipment that was used on a project actually was made in the United States. That's a percentage, by the way, that over time, over the years of the IRA, continues to step up. And the idea was to give industry an opportunity to sort of catch up and start to, a little bit of lead time on the investments that might be necessary to be made. This got really complicated. That's a lot of paperwork, number one. Number two, manufacturers like to be in the business to make money just like any other business, and disclosure of cost potentially compromises their ability to do that. So that guidance actually was not particularly popular with any projects, especially as you got down to projects that were smaller and smaller, and it basically excluded residential from being able to participate. Imagine the pile of paperwork that you're having to put together just to put a 7 kilowatt project on a roof. And this is, take a third-party financier. We all know a couple of large names, and there are now more entering the space, but they're having to do all of that paperwork for potentially tens of thousands of houses every year, and that's an overwhelming burden on paperwork. So the Treasury brought out some additional clarification in May of 2024. So that would be roughly 6 months ago from the time we're recording this webinar. And that actually simplified the process of being able to make a claim about the percentage of a particular project's equipment stack that was meeting the minimum threshold of domestic content for a given year. It literally turned it into a simplified table with essentially a checklist. And if you could qualify for domestic content on particular items of that checklist and you can get over the hurdle, then you're done. Super simple, really opened up the potential for being able to use this in a much broader fashion, particularly in distributed generation projects, whether that be C&I or whether that be resi. And it's created for many of the manufacturers all of a sudden a renewed sort of sense of urgency of investing in domestic manufacturing facilities. I think a lot of us have really been involved in that from a DG racking standpoint. Our brands were not being asked to participate until very recently because of the release of this new guidance. But even this new guidance doesn't provide a level of specificity that allows you to tell whether or not the products that you're buying necessarily fit in enough of the check boxes to know. And this is an issue that is less of a problem when you're talking about, for example, PV modules, or even, and I'll let Eric talk to the specifics for inverters, but for racking, the complications are sort of twofold. One is, depending on whether or not you're using steel, places a question mark on whether or not you might be able to increase the percentage of domestic content that you can take credit for on a given project. The other thing as well is the classification of components of the racking that are eligible to be considered isn't well enough identified for us to know how much racking actually has to be built in the United States for it to be sufficient to contributing to whatever your minimum might be. I realize that's a lot to say.
Yeah, and I was just going to try and sort of dumb it down a little bit for myself here for a second, because I think we've talked about this before, Corey. Really, it's like you can say rail in a racking system, and that sounds pretty easy to define. But what if, like an EcoFasten rail-less solution, is there a component there that is counted as rail? And I think the honest answer is we don't quite know yet.
That's a perfect example. And yes, we don't actually have total clarity. It even gets worse on the other side because there are only two components on the table for racking, and one of them is rail and the other one is fasteners.
Fasteners, right.
For those of us in the manufacturing space or know anything about hardware, a fastener is a nut and a bolt or a screw.
Yeah.
The problem is that there are lots of nuts and bolts and screws, and somehow you have to connect the rail to the roof, assuming you have a rail. And if you don't, on a railless system, what are you doing? It's really up in the air at the moment on what is a fastener and what isn't a fastener. So, and I can tell you, because I have a lot of these conversations with a lot of the finance organizations, they are all making decisions in the immediate term on whether to wait for the government to give us more clarity, or whether they want to take a particular position that allows them to take advantage of the domestic content credit sooner than later. And each one is making its own set of decisions on that.
Okay. So Eric, I did want to give you a chance to speak to, it's a little simpler on the inverter side, but we've got multiple columns to the safe harbor table, right? So I think we're mostly talking about the residential rooftop, but speak to that and speak to it with your commercial product as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the first time in my career, I get to say the inverter is actually the simplest part of this entire equation right now.
Yeah.
And the column that you're talking about is rooftop MLPE. That's part of that 2024 safe harbor table. Within that safe harbor table and the inverter section, there's really only 3 subcomponents that contribute the domestic content, and then a production credit if all of those components are manufactured in the US. And Enphase has made it pretty simple. We manufacture our PCBAs, so printed circuit board assemblies, electrical components, as well as our enclosure in the US, which also allows us to capture the production credit that's contained in, which totals 35.6% domestic content project level. So Enphase, as soon as, which is I would say a proof point of the guidance and the actual policy, as soon as we saw this safe harbor table come out, we said, okay, we understand that an inverter can contribute a significant amount of percentage domestic content project level. We're going to make a SKU that has all of those subcomponents manufactured in the US to effectively have 100% US made microinverter for both residential and commercial applications. And we call that our DOM SKU, DOM. It goes against 2 existing product lines. So folks are familiar with these products. They potentially even have these products designed into projects today, and the overall technical specification of both of those products from a residential and commercial perspective are identical. The only difference is that they're manufactured in the US. So Enphase has 2 SKUs, one for residential and one for commercial. Each of these SKUs contribute 35.6% domestic content project level. For the residential side, it's our IQ8HC, contributes 35.6% domestic content project level. And for the commercial side, we have our IQ8P 3P, which contributes 35.6% domestic content project level. Both of those are the exact same technical specifications of the non-DOM SKU. So for folks that have designed in projects and might have interconnection applications already set with those, pretty easy switchover. And then for new projects, you can leverage the same design, engineering, installation procedures, because it is the exact same SKU, only difference being that it's manufactured in the US 100%.
Yeah, that's great, actually. And David, it might be worth maybe taking a step up after complicating the picture on the racking side. A lot of people will go, wait, that's way too much headache. The fact of the matter is, for the next couple of years, particularly for residential, there will not be enough domestic manufacturing capacity for EV cells for the residential finance firms to be able to count domestically manufactured modules in sufficient percentage amounts to actually hit the minimum requirement of domestic content every year, which in 2024 is 40%. 2025, we expect it to move up to 45 and then 50 and then settle out at 55%. So what it means in the next year or two, meaning 2025 and maybe even 2026, this is going to come down to the inverter being a core component of getting you most of what you need to get up to that minimum threshold. And Eric, if you don't mind, can you repeat the amount again of percentage points?
The amount is 35.6%.
And the reason this is key and the reason the racking piece matters at all is because until you have a panel that can help you get from that 35.6 to 40 or 35.6 to 45, you're probably going to need racking to help you. The good news is that rails, depending upon which column you're looking at, bring you either 8 or 11% percentage points. So if you think about that for the moment, you could take a domestic content Enphase inverter and a microinverter, and you could add rails from Iron Ridge or EcoFasten that are domestic content. And that would get you to roughly 43, not quite 44%. So you get to clear the hurdle for 2024. But you need a little bit extra in 2025. And the strategy for each financier is how do they tick off a few more boxes in the right column on the safe harbor table to actually get to that 45%. And that's why racking will continue to be a part of this conversation, at least until we have enough PV module capacity with American-made cells to get you up that cost stack faster.
And if I could just say one last thing, what Corey is highlighting here is I think the real perception of the industry when the Inflation Reduction Act was first released is that no matter what, you had to have a significant percentage component contribution from a PV panel. And then the developers that we talk to, the installers that we talk to, all of them assume that if I can't get a hold of a domestic content PV module that contributes a significant amount of domestic content percentage project level, I'm not going to have a shot at this thing. I think a lot of folks kind of looked at, again, to Corey's point, the ramp up of the module side definitely takes time. We're not at a place today in 2024 that you can get a significant, allocation of domestic content modules. And so everyone kind of wrote 2024 off. It's going to just be too tough to capture. And I think what we are really here to show and to educate the listeners is that there is a very clear path to 40% this year. There is a clear path to 45% next year. I know we'll also maybe discuss a little bit about safe harbor as well as we change over on this new year a little bit later in this podcast. But if I can really say something loud and proud, it is you can capture, or I should say, your end customer can capture the domestic content bonus credit this year and next without significant contribution from a PV module.
Yeah, and let me just add on to that. I think with the approach that Enphase and Enstall have taken, it's actually very simple, right? Because both of you guys, from a company standpoint, have chosen to limit the domestic qualifying products to a very narrow selection of parts to make it simple, right? We don't have to look at 1,000 SKUs, right? So Corey, we're talking about for adding a rail is a simple, you said it, EcoFasten or Iron Ridge rail. That's one SKU in the BOM. The rest of it doesn't matter because you've already cleared that 40% threshold. Yeah.
That's correct, David. And not only that, but the guidance provides for you to focus on the vital few pieces that you need to get to that 40%. Mm-hmm. So there's no reason that an installer has to completely change up everything that they're currently procuring. All they need to do is make sure that they have enough of the right pieces to clear that 40%. That's correct.
Yeah, that's really remarkably simple. And I think there's something that feels like we're all, and I'm saying we as an industry, but the installer confusion is missing. And if I'm hearing you guys correctly, it's really about making I'll sort of use the choose your own adventure path.
Mm-hmm.
If you like the system you're on now, and there's not a clear single SKU designation from that product choice, that product manufacturer, whatever, then you may be looking at a harder path, right? If
That's right.
you're already using Iron Ridge and Enphase, or EcoFasten and Enphase, you probably don't have to change much of anything, and you don't have to load up on a whole bunch of additional products is kind of the takeaway here, right?
That's correct. And to sort of, again, double down on something that Eric said, Iron Ridge and EcoFasten have both tried to make this as easy as possible, in that both companies have established specific part numbers. Iron Ridge actually just tacked a US on the back of a part number that is currently available for the rails. And EcoFasten has a different part numbering scheme, but again, a dedicated part number. So it's really easy to know what to pick to clear the 40% for 2024. And on top of that, in the case of both Iron Ridge and EcoFasten, the material comes to BayWa in a packaging that is unique. So it's easy for the installer to identify when something is delivered to them, whether or not they've been delivered a product that actually would count toward the domestic content minimum. So it's really important to be able to, not only keep it as simple as we can, but also we need identification and verification to be really simple. And both companies, or all of our companies, are trying really hard to hit the easy button on this as much as possible, because there's plenty of complication to go around already.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue, Corey. Thanks for going there. And so I think that the context here is that there's a potential complexity adder for having multiple versions of the same product. But what you're pointing out is that manufacturer, distributor to installer, we're kind of aligning on some smart best practices to reduce that complexity, or to at least prevent undue risk. So let's talk about that. You mentioned, Corey, very specific SKU designation and packaging that not only is identifiable upfront from my vantage point, the distributor bringing it into the warehouse, I'm not going to have any problem confusing it with the non-domestic version in my WMS system, right? Because it's a unique SKU, unique barcode that I'm scanning. I'm tracking it digitally as well as visually. And then when I ship it out to an installer, I'm able to put it on an invoice as a unique product that I can add my description that says this is the domestic compliant product, right? And then it's coming to the installer's warehouse or job site ready to go for that project with that differentiator. And Eric, same goes for Enphase, right? I mean, you mentioned the DOM SKU designation, but tell us all, like, how do you see it on the product packaging or the product in the field?
Yeah. So on our actual microinverter, we list out the SKU. So you would see that domestic content SKU. We already had US in the SKU, so we had to go with DOM at the end. Yeah. And then there's an American flag there too, just to give a little bit of additional visual verification. But you do bring up a good point, David, where it is worth mentioning Enphase did have our manufacturing when we first started launching, for instance, our 3-phase product was manufactured in Mexico. And we have now fully transitioned the entire line to a production facility based in Arlington, Texas. But I think the call to action here is that if there's an installer here that potentially is sitting on some quote unquote old product, I mean, it's not going to be more than a year old because that's when we first started selling it. But if you're sitting on some old product that you potentially purchased, for instance, in maybe Q1 of this year, it is possible that that product does not contribute any domestic content contribution to a product level.
because of the timing of when it was produced and where it was produced. And
exactly.
Yeah.
And so we work, of course, with our distributors like BayWa and our installers to understand on a project level, what are the requirements? My sales team is always asking, are you guys chasing domestic content? And then we work with the installer through you guys to make sure that we're getting them the correct product and all the associated paperwork from an invoice perspective, and maybe a good segue too from a reliance letter perspective.
I was just going to go there. So we're talking about ways that we're making it easier for the installer to make sure that they're upfront selecting and buying the right product. And I'll say from BayWa's perspective, we've created badging on our web store. So when you're looking at all of the product options, you go and search for Enphase microinverters. You can see very clearly the HC DOM as a domestic compliant. It's got a special checkbox and a badge that says domestic compliant. And if you look at the regular HC, it'll just say assembled in the US, right? So There's your differentiation, trying to be super clear about it. So trying to help make sure that it's easy to pick the right product. Once that's selected and purchased, being sent through to the customer, to the installer, their job, their compliance responsibility is around making sure that gets onto the job, and that they've got documentation that they can pass on to the lease company, or if it's a commercial project, to ultimately the tax liable party, right? So the business owner. So what are the things that each of you is doing from a manufacturer perspective to support making that easy? What are the pieces that the installer should be expecting to need from you or from me to make sure these jobs pass through that hurdle?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start off and then throw it over to Corey, because there is a little bit of nuance here between the two different product types. So what Enphase has created is what is called a reliance letter. And this term reliance letter is really, I think, what the industry is kind of accepting as, here is the quote unquote proof that this SKU has this amount of domestic content, and this is what you are going to use when it comes time to file your taxes and capture that additional 10% domestic content bonus credit. This reliance letter has, and Enphase can send a template reliance letter to any listener here, so feel free to reach out, because that reliance letter does need to get specifically formatted to the business entity that is going to be actually filing the taxes. And it's a very simple, easy process.
That was going to be my question, Eric. A template is just, this is what the reliance letter would look like, but there still needs to be a unique one for each entity and for each project?
For each entity is my understanding. I might have, good. Corey's doing his
that wouldn't solve the paperwork complexity we were talking about earlier if it's for every single and residential project.
And what I will say is, there is a lot of vendors out in the space that haven't necessarily taken the time to really understand the fine print of what a vendor needs to do to prove and rely that they can trust that you can capture this domestic content bonus credit. So for example, if a vendor is telling you, I manufacture in the US, you're good to go. Don't worry about it. We make our stuff in the US. Thumbs up. That does not count when it comes time for the IRS and the auditors to come knocking at your door. You must have a reliance letter properly formatted to the business entity. That reliance letter should include the proper legal language and indemnification. It should list the product SKUs. It should list the specific percentages and numbers, and it should be signed by somebody that has the authority at the vendor. And I think BayWa has done a really good job of working with partners like Enphase and like Iron Ridge, Enstall, to make sure that you guys also have those letters, those template letters, and you've done a lot of the vetting. So I think your customers can trust that your sales teams have good education on this and that you're displaying the correct stuff on your website, to your point, David. But I really, really want to call out that especially some of the smaller mid-market vendors that may or may not, be available through BayWa, it is imperative that if you are chasing domestic content bonus credit, you have a reliance letter at bare minimum.
Corey, anything to add there?
No, Eric covered it really, really well. And it's another one of those moments where the inverter picture is so much cleaner at this stage of the game than the racking picture. And yet racking is going to be important for the next couple of years in terms of hitting the minimum. But the good news is that for the installer, again, we've done something to maybe make this a bit more of an easy button. And that is the approved vendor list, or AVL, that the various third-party financing firms are putting together with the manufacturers. So what I mean by that is, if an installer is talking to certain third-party finance firms, many of whom work with BayWa already in terms of being a fulfillment partner, the third-party finance firm probably already has an approved vendor list that will include Enphase and the Enphase parts. But more helpfully, maybe because racking is so odd, and each right now, just because of the state of the clarity of the requirements, each third-party finance firm will have made its own decision around which racking suppliers and which racking parts are going to qualify for domestic content when they file their taxes. Because remember, they're going to be the owners of the system. So it's easier for the installer. They'll just, the third-party finance firm will hand them the approved vendor list, and they can pick off of those. If you happen to be a fan of Iron Ridge, and if you aren't already, you should become a fan of Iron Ridge or EcoFasten. Both the Iron Ridge and EcoFasten have design assistants. This tends to be a popular way for a lot of installers to try and configure their racking bill of materials for a given job. And both of the design assistants actually provide a useful toggle so that you can configure the bill of materials and then hit the toggle, and it will change into the domestic content part numbers. So if you're trying to go source something from BayWa, you can actually take that bill of materials to BayWa and say, here's what I need from a domestic content standpoint on the racking side to comply with the AVL that the third-party finance organization has given me.
Well, there's a huge takeaway, because BayWa and Iron Ridge have already integrated that design assistant tool directly to our web store. So the installer, by virtue of doing the design, hitting that toggle, we automatically get that bill of materials. So well said, Corey. So yeah, I think what we're talking about here, and I want to really dive into, is the installer accountability. Then where should the installers be expending their effort on this? So one quick question: the reliance letter, is it the responsibility, as far as you guys are concerned, and maybe this is an opinion, but if there is fact here, that would be great to disclose. Do you see it as the installer's responsibility to get that reliance letter back to the finance company on the residential side? Or do you think the finance company is going to be working directly with you guys to have the reliance letters on file? And is that something? I mean, we definitely want this education, the installers, to be confident and feel comfortable. But in terms of their action item list and the takeaways that they're going to need to do you see that as being actually one of their accountabilities here? Or do you think BayWa and the manufacturer and the finance companies can sort of take care of that on behalf of the installer? Any ideas?
Eric, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that Enphase in general has provided reliance letters to most, at least on the residential side, to most of the large finance TPO companies that are out there that residential installers work with. So, always good to get a double check on that. But Enphase has very close relationships with all of those entities. On the commercial side, I would say that Enphase's position is that it is the installer's scope and responsibility, just from a ease of doing business, to capture that reliance letter from Enphase and get it formatted to their customer, and then they deliver that to the end customer, business entity, tax filer for a commercial facility. So
similar to providing the disclose the bill of materials, right?
Yep.
That this is what was used on that project. That's part of that evidentiary path.
And I'm sure, at some point in 2025, we're going to get a call from the mom and pop coffee shop that says, my installer, is out of business or whatever. I had a poor experience, but I need to file my taxes. And I see that, I need to have a reliance letter. Of course, Enphase is happy to support the end customer. We just need to make sure that the SKU that they have used is the SKU that they're expecting, just so they don't get caught by surprise when it comes time, for tax filing and potentially auditors. So.
Yeah, I think I think to maybe try and simplify this for the residential side, remember that a homeowner is not going to be able to take the tax credit themselves. It's going to be the third-party finance organization that takes the tax credit. And speaking from a racking point of view, if the racking is on the AVL for the third-party finance organization, that organization has already satisfied itself through paperwork that we have provided through our brands to the third-party finance organization. And there isn't anything that the installer should have to worry about on the residential side. Eric was talking about how commercial might be a little different. It has to do with the fact, if you remember when we were talking at the beginning, a little bit of the history of how we got here on domestic content, there's sort of two ways that the work can be done to get eligibility on a C&I project. And that might require some disclosure or some paperwork gathering by the installer to support whoever the financier might be. Maybe, there are people that both of our companies work with, all of our companies work with, to work with installers who actually are self-financing. And in that case, you're providing it to the installer. But I think as a rule of thumb, if you're doing residential and you're buying off of a third-party organization's AVL, that work has been done for you already.
That's a great way to say it, Corey. And that's kind of what I sort of a little bit of an aha for me is thinking about that due diligence has to occur in order to meet the eligibility for the tax credit. The difference on the resi side is that someone else who is responsible for it has already done it, and it covers a lot of the market, right? A lot of the installer business. On the commercial side, that doesn't necessarily exist unless there's a commercial financier that somehow is involved in multiple projects, but more often than not, it's going to be the building owner that owns that asset rather than some kind of a third-party finance in the commercial space, right? So it's sort of the commercial have to do it all themselves. That's why they need to be smart about this, learn the rules, figure it out. And the installer, while not on the hook for the money, they're being asked to do all the work. So that's why they need to be as smart as they can about it.
That's correct. On the commercial side, the paperwork starts becoming much more customized. And so Eric was explaining a bit about the process of reliance letters a little earlier, and we see that a lot on the commercial side. Whereas on the residential side, we as the manufacturers tend to do a lot of that legwork in advance for the installer.
So before we move on to kind of the action items and takeaways for the installers as the next steps, both of you have domestically manufactured products that are available in the market today. They've been manufactured, they've been shipped to distributors like BayWa. How much more are you guys planning? And what about the rest of the landscape? Are we still at that very early adoption phase? And what I hear from installers is that they just don't have any confidence that there's product out there. And so just kind of wanted to paint that picture a little more clearly for everyone in terms of where we are on this adoption curve and the supply chain availability and how much is that going to change in the next maybe 6 months?
Sales guy will jump in here first. Let me be very clear and proud to say that Enphase has domestic content microinverters today. We are delivering domestic content microinverters to customers today. We are loading partners like BayWa with stock to support the demand that we're already starting to see today. And Enphase as a whole, we have 2 manufacturing facilities here in the US. Those manufacturing facilities can manufacture millions of microinverters per quarter. We work with our contract manufacturers to either bring up lines, pull down lines, shift lines from SKUs. So yeah, not to sound too salesy here, but we can support whatever demand the market gives us. And we're already starting to see that demand really start to scale as the sophisticated installers, developers, finance entities start to realize the unbelievable opportunity that this has. So I don't know if I could be more clear than that.
Well, I'm glad we let the sales guy go first, because that allows me to say what he said. But maybe to provide a little bit more color on the racking side, we also have been shipping. We are manufacturing. We are shipping. Our fulfillment partners are stocking, and I would say at the same time that I think we're still in the early stages of adoption of domestic content. And a lot of that is because if you look at the C&I side of things, things have been clear enough on the regulation front to make domestic content as a bonus credit actionable since May of last year. But for residential, it's really only been since May of this year. And the fact that we are fortunate that we had domestic manufacturing capability and capacity before the clarity came out on the regulation in May of this year. We've been able to leverage that and expand it. We are aggressively making additional investments because we expect, as more third-party firms become more comfortable with the guidance and have made their decisions, we're going to see additional uptake. And we're going to see additional innovation on the financing side too, I think, next year. And a lot of that will be leveraging domestic content. And I would posit for next year and probably a good chunk of 2026, while the cell manufacturing capacity ramps up, there's going to be a heavy reliance by the third-party finance firms, whether we're talking about commercial or whether we're talking about residential, on the inverter and the racking to pull enough points together to make projects domestic content eligible. And we'll continue to invest. We'll continue to aggressively expand our capabilities and capacities, and we'll continue to expand the number of products that are available as third-party finance firms provide us with additional guidance on what it is they would like to include.
That's excellent.
Yeah, and I would just also say really quick, last kind of call to action regarding that is, for the listeners, as you start to think about this, we are introducing a new product SKU, right? And I think it's really important for the listeners to work with your sales teams to make sure that if you're thinking about this transition, that you're planning for it accordingly to ensure that BayWa has the appropriate stock, especially if you're scaling or transitioning over to a domestic content SKU. And then as a result, manufacturers like us know how to properly plan to satisfy the demand that's in the market.
Yep, that's a great point. And maybe I don't want to make a line between sales and ops thinking, but when you say, make sure that we know the planning, is it as simple as I'm moving 100% of my business to this new SKU because I'm covered, or are there easy ways to think about I sell on the resi side 60% lease products, and so I'm going to move 60% of my volume to that SKU, but I'm going to leave the rest of it the same. Commercial, like, at what point does the installer really understand how they're planning their business versus is sort of happening to them, if that makes sense.
I'll give Eric a moment to think about it. First reaction. For any given installer, they're running a business. In most cases, the installer is selling solar projects to homeowners or to businesses, and those projects are being financed. If those projects are being financed by some sort of lease or PPA, then you start to, depending on how much of your business gets captured in that area, that's the area that most likely is going to be offering financing packages both today or in the near future that sort of include domestic content as part of the value proposition of that package. So if you're an individual installer and you already know that you're either currently using leases and PPAs for a large part of what you're doing, or you plan on doing it in the future as part of growing your business, that's the part that you probably need to plan on making all domestic content.
So the installer making their choices of, I want to do it the easy way. I want to do it without a lot of disruption to my company. I want it with the least number of required parts. Those kinds of choices is what you're saying. Make those choices now. Don't wait for someone to tell you what you can choose from. Go ahead and make those choices now.
I would recommend it, in large part because we are in the early stages, which means the uptake is strong, but it's still, because it's early stages, there aren't as many third-party finance firms that have offered something specific. But next year, new financial year, new financing packages are coming out. That is all of a sudden, I think, going to have an inflection point in terms of demand. It's important that you're talking to your distributor about what it is you plan on procuring so that they can start revving up their engines to make sure they have the right stuff in stock before you're actually going to place an order for it. That's going to be really important.
Yeah, and I think thanks for taking the ball there, Corey. And he covered it really good, especially from the residential side, and I mean from the commercial side, and I mean really just in general. Enphase always works with our installers to forecast what their business looks like so that we can work with BayWa to make sure that everything is stocked and understand what those take rates are. But it should be worth mentioning that as folks begin to understand the opportunity of the domestic content side, there will be high demand for this product. And us as manufacturers always try to keep up with that demand. But because we are businesses and try to plan our operations efficiently, for example, if someone has a pipeline in 2025 that now is going to fully transition over to domestic content, right? Whatever, 30 megawatts of rooftop, that BayWa is under the assumption is using a non-domestic SKU, and that developer or installer realizes they want to take advantage of it. We just simply want to make sure that we understand that switch of SKU so that we can plan accordingly. Really as simple as that.
Yeah, that's great, Eric. And I think maybe I was making it more complex in the way I was asking it, but I think that's the key, right? Is this is not brand new market share, brand new business opportunity. It's a shift from non-domestic to domestic, right? And I think all of us don't want to be stuck with a whole bunch of demand and inventory of non-domestic components that are no longer being demanded in the marketplace. So you guys are expecting this to be a shift to an alternative product, an alternative manufacturing supply chain of product. And so I guess maybe that's a request to our listeners, if you're on the installer side, is be a little bit transparent with us. Be honest about how you're strategizing for your business. And are you leaning into more third-party finance projects? Are you leaning into more commercial? And what are you not doing instead? Because it probably isn't ultimately additive. You're not tripling the size of your business when you give us a very large forecast for domestic. Whatever you were doing non-domestic probably is being diminished, right? So let's just be honest about that. Have that conversation. Well, I think that'll help everybody in having access to the supply and the product.
Yeah, and I would honestly say, at least from what we've seen on our sales team, and this is probably more commercial specific, but it is both a shift plus potential upside, as this domestic content bonus credit sometimes unlocks new opportunities and new markets for customers, right? We have a lot of installers coming to us saying, geez, now that I can capture this additional 10%, that effectively lowers the bottom line price of this system that I might have lost out on last year. I can then go back to that customer and give him this option as an offering and capture that business. There's also interesting markets that are opening up related to this. For instance, we talk to a lot of installers that are starting to focus, for instance, on houses of worship, municipalities, universities, mush markets, because part of the Inflation Reduction Act is a cash payment in lieu of tax credit. So now you have your 30% ITC, you have your 10% domestic content bonus credit. And even more so, a lot of these facilities are also in opportunity zones. A installer and our commercial installers are actually staffing sales teams to focus on these markets where you can go and present a commercial PV system where 50% of that project cost comes back to that commercial entity as a cash check from the IRS. Again, not a tax legal consultant. Make sure you check with all of that. But it is a very, very interesting market type, and one that, our savvy customers are really starting to attack and view it as upside business in 2025.
And that's a really fair point. I would not argue at all that that's an upside additive to their business. Yeah. And hopefully that opportunity leads to an expansion of our industry and the growth of these smart installers, or we add that capacity to the marketplace. So I want to zoom out a little bit now and say, kind of, what did we miss? Are there pieces of this conversation that we thought we would get to that we didn't? Any other really important takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I'll start off by saying we're talking about taxes, so there's probably something that we missed. And what the reason I really say that is, I think, Enphase and Enstall have really been leading the way in understanding this, but also interacting directly with our customers, right? This is just such a new concept. My team, all of the sales teams here are really well informed on this. Enphase specifically also has specific finance teams that can help chat through this. And what we find is that there's unique situations based on what the installer type is, what markets they're going after, what projects they're going after. And my main call to action, if we did miss something, which I'm sure we did, again, based on the unique kind of picture of said listener's story, is feel free to reach out to us. If you have questions about this, engage the vendors directly. The vendors that will not engage you directly should kind of be red flag number one, because it means they probably don't know what they're talking about. Same goes for distributors. So yeah, I mean, that's, I would say, my kind of call to action. We'll of course kind of post some general email links, but from a commercial perspective, which is my team, commercial sales at enphaseenergy.com. If you ever want to speak to anybody about this topic or commercial in general, always feel free to reach out. We typically answer those emails within 24 hours.
Awesome, Corey.
Yeah, Eric covered it really, really well. This is, if we harken back to the beginning of this conversation, I said that things are a moving target, and they are. We're all expecting additional clarification. Like Eric said, we're not tax advisors either. We're not accountants. We are taking guidance from our own advisors. The TPO firms are taking counsel from their advisors. Any installer that's thinking about getting into this, particularly if they're planning on owning the systems and self-financing projects, you need to make sure you're getting a tax advisor. Don't be shy, ask questions. And as Eric said, we are more than happy to talk to any installer and help sort of craft a strategy with them on how they are going to hit the minimums for domestic content in any given year. And you're welcome to, at any time, get on our websites, ecofastandsolar.com, ironridge.com, panelclaw.com, and talk to us. We also will get right back to you. We want to help you make sure that you're spending your money as wisely as possible, and at the same time that you're well advised as you try and make these decisions, and as you try and keep track of the moving targets.
That's excellent. And I'll make the same plug for BayWa. Please engage your outside sales reps, your inside sales reps, use them to access the rest of the BayWa leadership team. On our website, we've included informational pages about what are we doing with these badges, what do the different designations mean, and why does it matter? We've tried to kind of simplify and distill what domestic content is and what it isn't, so that you can be a little bit more informed and hopefully demystify the process. So I think we're all linking arms here and united in let's demystify, let's simplify, let's take advantage of the opportunity, let's grow the industry, let's get smarter together. And I think as long as we continue to lean into those partnerships, incredibly strong, incredibly empowering, and I think our closest installers will agree, we really do function so much better, so much more effectively, and quite frankly, have more fun and more engagement when we do this together. And it really makes a difference. I really thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Daniela, take us away.
Thank you again, Corey Geiger from Enstall US, Eric Bergman, Enphase, and David Dunlap from BayWa RE for this incredibly insightful conversation on domestic content. And thank you to you, dear listeners. Please reach out to your BayWa representative if you have any questions, and to our fantastic partners at Enphase and Enstall. Thank you so much, everyone.